But now we move on. Student sit-ins, industrial workers going on strike. The protests over the death of Mahsa Amini in Iran are evolving now. Iran is braced for another night of protest and defiance of a government accused more and more widely across the country of repression. Mahsa Amini died in police custody on September the 13th. She'd been arrested by Iran's so-called morality police for how she wore her headscarf. The UK has declared sanctions against Iran's so-called morality police. The Foreign Office said it was imposing asset freezes and travel bans on members of the force, as well as both its chief, Mohammad Rostami Shishemigachi, and the head of the Tehran division, Haj Ahmed Mezai. Let's get more analysis. We're joined by Tara Kangalu, journalist and author of the book The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People. Tara is also a professor at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being with us. Start with the UK sanctions. Do you feel this will make any impact?
Thank you so much for having me. By the way, this is not just something that's coming from the UK. Canada, just a few days ago, sanctioned hundreds of Iranian officials. Germany is also sending tough messages. So I think the international community is coming together to figure out and in ways scramble ways on showing some strong standing against the brutality that the Iranian regime is pursuing and handling these unprecedented protests on the ground. But quite frankly, we're not seeing any results of such stance and sanctions, even though they are recent. And as you know, there are still conversations going on between the government of Iran and, of course, world powers over the sort of impending revival of JCPOA. So I believe, as many people on the ground in Iran say and want, is whatever engagement world powers were to have with the government of Iran should most certainly include human rights, women's rights, and civil rights issues as well.
So in terms of what the UK, Canada, as you rightly point out, and Germany are all saying, do you feel it's going to make any difference on the streets of Tehran between now, overnight, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month?
Unfortunately, I have to say no. What's going on on the streets of Iran are the result of years of perpetual wrongdoing by the regime against the people, and the world is not new to this. They have seen this for 4 decades. So would we see results in a day or two? By such measures, I'm afraid not.
Tara, the scale of the demonstrations that we're seeing, they've been continuous since September the 13th, when Mahsa Amini tragically died in circumstances that obviously Iran has one story and the world has a different story as to why she died. But what do these demonstrations, their scale, the extent of how far they're reaching across Iran, what is this telling you about the state of play inside Iran's borders now?
Great question. I think, as you mentioned, these protests are quite different from what we've seen in 2019 or what we saw in 2009. We are seeing wide scale of protests and people from different walks of life, various socio-political groups and classes coming together on one mission, and that mission is change, systematic change to ways of life. They are coming together united, young and old, women and men. I mean, we're seeing images out of middle schools, high school, images that are fascinating. There is no fear. People, especially young people, they have no fear. I grew up in Iran, and I remember how intimidated and fearful we were to raise our voice. But young kids, young students, boys and girls, they're not afraid anymore. And one thing I want to share is that today, I think the world is seeing how 80 plus millions of ordinary Iranians are different than that of the governing system. And I think that's important for the world to see. And back to your question on what the international community can do, perhaps to bring effective change, is to amplify these voices, to underscore the reality that millions of people, 80 million, are different than the policies of the regime.
Tara, can these protests be sustained? We're expecting another night of protests this very evening. Can it be sustained, or is it just a question of time before the crackdown, which is already going on, becomes so severe that it has to stop?
I think it's inevitable for us to look at the government and see that they are weakened in ways that's reflective in the extent of their crackdown. Someone told me in Iran, in my last interview with this person, she said, with every bullet shot, the government is shooting itself in the leg. The government of this country is unmasked. And while the protests without a systematic and sustainable leadership domestically may not result in immediate change, they're not going anywhere. As someone else told me, there is no turning back. Iran and the Iranian society will not be the same as it was before September 13, as you mentioned. These movements are not going anywhere, and people are not going to stop until they see change, until they see a systematic answer to their very, very valid demands on all fronts.
Tara Kangalu, journalist, author of The Heartbeat of Iran, Real Voices of a Country and Its People, professor at Georgetown University, and Iranian, brought up in Iran. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your analysis with us here on France 24. We appreciate it. And we, of course, will watch for all developments on the situation in Iran overnight. More demonstrations, more protests in defiance of calls from the president and everyone high in Iran to stop the people taking to the street and calling for the change that they think has to happen since the death of a 22-year-old Kurdish woman in police custody.